There is a version of Sandra Lee that the world fell in love with. The woman behind the kitchen counter, radiant and warm, turning simple ingredients into something that felt like home. She smiled on the covers of magazines. She filled television screens with laughter and light. She made cooking feel accessible and joy feel possible. And yet, behind every perfectly arranged table, behind every holiday spread and camera-ready moment, there was a story she never fully told. A pain she carried quietly, the way some people carry old photographs, folded, worn at the edges, tucked away where no one else can see. What does it cost a woman to build an empire on warmth when her own childhood was cold? What happens when the person the world sees as unbreakable finally begins to crack? And what does it mean to survive not once, not twice, but over and over again, each time rising from a different kind of wreckage? This is not the Sandra Lee from the magazine covers. This is the woman underneath. And her story will change the way you see everything you thought you knew about her. She was born on July 3, 1966, in Santa Monica, California, a city that shimmers like a promise, all golden light and ocean breeze, where the air smells of salt and possibility. But the house Sandra grew up in was nothing like the postcard version of California. It was a house fractured by instability, shaped by the particular kind of chaos that comes when the adults in a child's life are too consumed by their own pain to tend to anyone else's. Her mother, Vicky Christensen, was young and struggling, a woman who battled addiction in ways that left her children to fend for themselves more often than any child should ever have to. Her father was largely absent, a figure more mythological than real, present enough to leave a wound, but not enough to leave a foundation. Sandra was the eldest of 5 children. 5. And from the time she was old enough to understand what hunger felt like, she understood that she was responsible not just for herself, but for the small people around her who looked to her with wide eyes and empty stomachs. She was 7 years old the first time she made dinner for her siblings. 7 years old, standing on a step stool in a kitchen that wasn't always stocked, trying to piece together a meal from whatever was left in the cupboards. That image, a child on a step stool, stirring something in a pot, feeding a family that should have been feeding her, is not just a detail. It is the key to understanding everything Sandra Lee would one day become. Her mother's addiction meant the family moved constantly. Schools changed. Friendships were cut off before they could take root. There is a particular loneliness that comes from always being the new girl, from learning that it's safer not to get too attached because tomorrow you might be somewhere else entirely. Sandra learned to read a room faster than most adults ever do. She learned to make herself useful, to be the one who kept things together, because the alternative, falling apart, was a luxury no one in her family could afford. She learned to cook not from a place of passion, but from a place of survival. She learned to set a beautiful table not because someone taught her, but because beauty, in the middle of chaos, is a form of resistance. When Sandra was 11, her mother left, not just emotionally, but physically. The children were sent to live with their grandparents in Sumner, Washington, a small town east of Tacoma where the winters are gray and the air carries the smell of pine and damp earth. Her grandparents, Lorraine and Bill Waldrop, were people of faith and discipline. They provided structure where there had been none. They provided consistency, but they could not undo what had already been done. They could not fill the particular shaped hole that a mother's absence carves into a child's chest. That hole has a sound. It sounds like silence at the dinner table. It sounds like the absence of the word, "I love you," spoken freely and without condition. Sandra heard that silence every day, and she filled it the only way she knew how, by making things beautiful, by being useful, by becoming indispensable. There is one moment from Sandra's childhood that she has returned to in interviews over the years, quietly, carefully, as if even now it costs her something to speak it aloud. She was a teenager, and her mother had reappeared, the way mothers like that sometimes do, cycling back into the lives they'd left, carrying apologies that didn't quite cover the debt. Sandra had cooked a meal. She had set the table the way she always did, with care, with intention, making something ordinary feel special. And her mother, sitting across from her, looked at the table and said nothing. Not thank you. Not this is beautiful. Nothing. Sandra has described the particular sting of that silence. The way it confirmed something she had been fighting against believing her entire life. The idea that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she gave, it would never be enough to make the people who were supposed to love her stay. That moment did not break her, but it shaped her. It sent a message down into the deepest part of her, into the place where identity is formed, and that message said, you have to earn love. You have to perform it. You have to set the table perfectly every single time, because the moment you stop, the moment you let the cracks show, everyone will leave. She carried that belief into adulthood the way you carry a stone in your shoe. You forget it's there most of the time, but every step reminds you. By the time Sandra was in her early 20s, she was living in Los Angeles, broke in the specific way that is terrifying rather than romantic. Not broke with a trust fund waiting in the wings. Broke in the way where you count the days until the next paycheck and the math never quite works out. She had been working since she was a teenager, picking up jobs wherever she could, waitressing, retail, anything that kept the lights on. She had the energy of someone who had never been allowed to slow down, who had learned that stillness was dangerous, that the moment you stopped moving, the life you'd built could collapse beneath you. She had an idea, a product. She had been watching the home goods market, studying what was missing, identifying a gap that nobody else seemed to see. She designed window treatments, home decor products, and she believed in them with the kind of conviction that is indistinguishable from desperation. She pitched them to Kmart. She walked into those meetings with every ounce of confidence she could manufacture, wearing clothes that said success, while her bank account said something very different. And then she got rejected. Again and again. The door closed on her. And then again. There is a particular kind of dark that settles in when you have given everything you have to something and it still isn't working. When you have shown up prepared, when you have done the work, when you have believed, and the world has not believed back. Sandra hit that dark in her late 20s, and it was deep. She has spoken about the fear during that period, the suffocating weight of it, the voice in her head that sounded uncomfortably like the silence at that childhood dinner table, whispering that she was not enough, that she would never be enough. She maxed out credit cards. She borrowed money. She kept going not because she had some cinematic surge of inner strength, but because stopping felt more impossible than continuing. Sometimes survival doesn't look heroic. Sometimes it just looks like getting up one more time because the alternative is unthinkable. That is what Sandra did. She got up one more time. And then, slowly, in the way that real breakthroughs happen, not like a thunderclap, but like dawn, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. Kmart said yes. Not to one product. To an entire line. The semi-homemade concept. The idea that cooking didn't have to be all or nothing. That you could combine store-bought shortcuts with homemade touches to create something beautiful without sacrificing your entire weekend, resonated. It resonated because it was real. It wasn't aspirational in the punishing way that so much food media was. It was accessible. It spoke to the woman who worked 2 jobs and still wanted to put something meaningful on the table for her family. It spoke to the person who wanted beauty in their life but didn't have unlimited time or resources to achieve it. It spoke, though Sandra probably didn't say this outright at the time, directly to the child she had been, the one on the step stool, making do, making it beautiful anyway. Food Network came calling. Semi-homemade cooking with Sandra Lee debuted in 2003, and the response was immediate and visceral. People loved her. Not just the recipes, her. The warmth she brought to the screen, the way she made you feel like she was cooking in your kitchen, like she knew exactly what your week had looked like, and wanted to make this one moment in it easier and more joyful. The show ran for 11 seasons. 11 seasons. That is not luck. That is connection. That is a woman who understood her audience because she had once been her audience, stretching ingredients, stretching time, making something from what felt like nothing. She became a brand, a face, a presence that extended far beyond the kitchen. She authored cookbooks that sold in the millions. She launched product lines. She appeared on magazine covers. She sat across from talk show hosts and sparkled and charmed and made it all look effortless. And in the way that fame works, the effortlessness was part of the product. The warm, competent, unflappable woman who always knew exactly what she was doing. The step stool was invisible now. The empty cupboards were invisible. The silence at that childhood dinner table was invisible. Sandra Lee had built a world so full of color and warmth and beauty that the darkness underneath was entirely hidden. But darkness does not disappear simply because you build something beautiful on top of it. In 2011, Sandra's relationship with Andrew Cuomo became public knowledge in the fullest sense. He was running for governor of New York, and she stood beside him, poised and polished, playing a role that was complicated in ways the cameras couldn't fully capture. She was not his wife. She was his partner. And in the strange theater of American politics, that distinction mattered more than it should have. There were people who scrutinized her, who questioned her, who treated her presence as a footnote rather than a chapter. She had spent her entire life working to be seen as substantial, to be taken seriously on her own terms, and now she found herself defined largely by her proximity to a man with a powerful last name. She handled it with the grace she had always handled everything, publicly, at least. She smiled. She supported. She showed up. She set the table, metaphorically and literally, because that was what she knew how to do. But those who watched closely could sometimes see, in an unguarded moment, the particular exhaustion of a woman who had been performing strength for so long, she had almost forgotten what it felt like to put it down. Then came 2015, the word that changes everything. Cancer. Sandra Lee was diagnosed with breast cancer in May of 2015, and the announcement landed in the world with the weight of something unexpected and terrible. She had a double mastectomy. She spoke about it publicly, which was itself a form of courage, to allow the world into a moment of such profound physical and emotional vulnerability, when every instinct built over a lifetime of survival was telling her to keep it together, keep it private, keep it beautiful. She didn't. She let people see the fear. She let people see the surgery and the recovery and the days when beauty was impossible because she was too tired and too raw and too human. She let the cracks show. And something extraordinary happened. The world didn't leave. The people who had watched her set beautiful tables for over a decade watched her now, in her hospital gown, and they didn't look away. They leaned in. Because what Sandra Lee showed in those months after her diagnosis was not the woman the brand had built. It was the woman underneath the brand, the girl from Santa Monica who had survived everything that life had thrown at her and was not finished surviving yet. She recovered. She came back to her work. She came back to her relationship. She came back with the particular quietness of someone who has looked at their mortality and decided, deliberately, what matters and what is not. The things that had once seemed essential. The perfect presentation, the flawless performance, the table set just so, began to loosen their grip, not disappear. Sandra Lee is not a woman who leaves beauty behind, but loosen. There is a difference between setting a table because you are afraid of what happens if you don't and setting a table because you genuinely love the way it makes people feel. For the first time in perhaps her entire life, Sandra was beginning to discover that difference. Her relationship with Andrew Cuomo stretched 14 years. 14 years is not a footnote. It is a chapter. In many ways, it is several chapters. There were the years of traveling between New York and California, of maintaining a life that existed in two places at once, of being a partner to a man in one of the most scrutinized positions in American public life, while also running a media empire of her own. There were moments of genuine happiness, photographs of them together in which the warmth looks real because it was real. There were also, inevitably, compromises, adjustments, the particular negotiations that any long relationship requires. Sandra has spoken carefully about those years, in the way that people who have genuinely loved someone speak about it when the love is over, with respect, with honesty, without cruelty. They separated in 2019. After 14 years, they separated. And Sandra, who had spent her entire life pouring her energy into building things, products, shows, relationships, tables, had to learn, at 52 years old, what it felt like to sit in the quiet of her own life and decide what came next on her own terms. The answer was not immediate. It rarely is. But it came. She returned to television with a clarity she hadn't always possessed. She began speaking more openly about her childhood, about the mother who left, about the step stool and the empty cupboards and the table she had been trying to set her entire life. She let the story be complicated. She let her mother be complicated. Neither villain nor redemption story, but a human being who had failed in specific ways and succeeded in others. She spoke about forgiveness not as something she had achieved fully, but as something she was working toward, the way you work toward anything that matters. Imperfectly, consistently, without a finish line. She spoke about her faith. Sandra Lee has never worn her spirituality loudly, but it is there, woven through everything she has ever said about survival and resilience, and the strange grace of finding yourself still standing after everything that tried to knock you down. She has spoken about prayer not as a performance, but as a private conversation, the kind you have in the early morning when the world is still dark and you are trying to remember why you are doing any of this. That conversation, she says, has never failed her. Not in the hospital. Not in the ending of a long love. Not in the mornings when the old voice, the one that sounds like silence at a dinner table, tries to tell her she is not enough. She knows now, or is learning to know, that she has always been enough. That the step stool was not a symbol of her inadequacy. It was a symbol of her capacity, her extraordinary, almost unreasonable capacity to show up for the people around her even when no one was showing up for her. At 59, Sandra Lee is not the same woman who stood in front of Kmart buyers with nothing but conviction and a product line that hadn't sold yet. She is not the same woman who smiled through 14 years of public scrutiny and private compromise. She is not even the same woman who lay in a hospital bed in 2015 and let the world see her afraid. She is something more than all of those women, and she carries each of them with her. The child on the step stool, the young woman who maxed out her credit cards on a dream, the cancer survivor, the partner, the public figure, the very private person underneath all of it. She still sets the table. Of course she does. But now when she does it, there is something different in the gesture. There is intention where there was once anxiety. There is pleasure where there was once performance. The table is beautiful. It has always been beautiful. But now it is set for herself as much as for anyone else. And that, perhaps, is the most remarkable thing she has ever created. Now I want to speak to you directly. Yes, you, the person watching this. Because Sandra Lee's story is not just about Sandra Lee. It is about every person who learned too young that love is something you have to earn. Every person who made themselves useful because being unnecessary felt too dangerous. Every person who built something beautiful on top of something broken and then stood back and wondered why they still felt empty sometimes, why the applause never quite filled the silence. You know that step stool. Maybe it looked different in your life. Maybe it wasn't a kitchen. Maybe it was a classroom where you worked twice as hard as everyone else because you had to prove something. Maybe it was a relationship where you gave more than you received because the idea of asking for equal ground felt like too much of a risk. Maybe it was a career built on competence because competence, unlike love, felt reliable. It wouldn't leave, it wouldn't disappear, it wouldn't stand across from you at a table and say nothing. Sandra Lee spent decades setting beautiful tables for a world that didn't always see the child underneath who just wanted someone to say thank you. To say I see you. To say this is enough. You are enough. And here is what I want you to sit with today. The things you create out of pain are still real. The beauty you make from broken pieces is still beauty. But you do not have to keep your survival wound as your operating system forever. You are allowed to put down the step stool. You are allowed to cook because you love it, not because you're afraid of what happens if you stop. Sandra is still learning this. At 59, she is still learning what it feels like to want something for herself without immediately framing it as something she can give to others. That is not a failure. That is the most honest kind of progress. The kind that doesn't come with a finish line or a magazine cover or a perfectly arranged centerpiece. The kind that happens quietly, in the early morning, when the world is still dark and you are still becoming whoever you are going to be.